I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Siân Hughes has written a most elegant elegiac. Oh wow, this book. The sentences in this book, the characters in this book, the sense of place. I mean, there is so much beauty in this tiny novel that was long listed for the Booker Prize in the UK. It's called Pearl. And Siân is joining us actually from her bookshop in Cheshire in the UK. And it's really good to see you, Siân. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So would you explain Cheshire, where you are, and the village where your shop is as well? Because I don't think a ton of us know exactly where you are right now.
No, well, I'm in a little corner of Cheshire, which is about 2 miles from Wales. And it's just like a little hidden rural corner. There's nothing very spectacular or remarkable in the landscape. It's just farmlands, lots of rivers and ditches and hedges. And it's the landscape I grew up in. This is my home village. I grew up here. This is where my parents and my grandparents are buried. And the place names in the book are real places. Duckington Lane is the lane down to my village of Tilston. Tilston is my home village. And we do have an annual grave dressing festival there called the Wakes, which features in the book and which probably went back to pre-Christian times. But for as long as the village has been there, there's been an annual sort of festival of the dead and dressing the graves, which still happens. So, yeah, when I was writing the book, I remember saying to my sister, who also still lives here with her family, saying, oh, if only I were Irish, people might buy this book. Because there's a thing, you know, where things are set in rural communities and where people feel a sense of home, even if they don't live there or they move away to work and come back, that they know that's their home village and that's where they really belong. And I was saying to my sister, I don't know if anyone really thinks that English people still have that. There's such a small number of us live in the countryside. So if only if I were Irish, people would believe me.
So when you say village, how many people is that?
About 550.
So you know everyone. I mean, essentially,
no,
you know
not
everyone.
Really.
No?
No,
okay.
not really. But I'd certainly recognise their faces.
Okay.
Yeah. When my son was at primary school there, I probably would have known most people just from going to and fro the school. Yeah. And my son was actually at school with his cousins as well, which is a proper country thing.
I grew up in a suburb of Massachusetts, and it was a lot more than 550 people, and it really felt like we knew everyone. So my immediate response is, once you leave a major city, I'm like, don't you just know everyone? Because I really did feel like I knew my entire town.
It is a strange thing. I mean, as a young person growing up, I hated that. You know, I just really wanted to get away from it. It was just like wanted some anonymity and some city life and all those things. And then I came back to the village to look after my mother in her last illness. And obviously, I've been visiting the village to visit my parents all those years. And my children always spoke about us possibly going there as going home. Oh, shall we move home now? When are we moving home? You know. And then after my mother died, I moved there permanently. And that was when I wrote the book. When I was living in that landscape where everything, immediately after her death, everything reminded me of her. She had a favourite field and like favourite walks. And I'd just be walking my dog around and I'd think, that's where she used to pick blackberries. That's where she got damsons for jam. Like everything was connected to her. And I thought, while I'm sort of living in this feeling where everything feels connected to her absence, I'm going to write the book, and which I tried to write on several other occasions in my life. So I'm going to try and write it now and try and just write it with that feeling.
It's the story of a young woman, Marianne. Her mother has disappeared. She calls her father Edward because, you know, everyone was calling him Edward. So here's Edward. She has a little brother. And suddenly they are in a really deeply unfamiliar landscape. And you've described this book in earlier interviews. You've described it as sort of a lifelong obsession, that it went through countless drafts that you had been working at, that these characters had come to you when you were very young, as a teenager, right? Teenager, early 20s?
Yeah. They were actually invented for a school homework, a high school homework.
Okay.
Yeah. I was we were set a homework, we had to think of a building that was interesting and put people in it. And there was a building I went past when I was cycling to my boyfriend's house. And it was a really beautiful, crumbling old building. I'd never been inside it, but it had about 6 different ages of building, and they weren't really properly melded together, you know, sort of leaning on each other. All windows were different shapes. And so I put people inside all the windows. And, you know, I had to go back to school and ask for an extra exercise book because I'd filled the first one because I got completely carried away. And these characters just lived with me and lived with me for years and years. And I know a lot more about them than I could possibly put in one book. They sort of part of my mental landscape, all of these people.
Have you read North Woods by Daniel Mason?
No, I don't know that.
If you have a chance, I'm pretty sure it's out in the UK, but he tells 400 years in the history of a house in Western Massachusetts. And so you meet all of the people who roll through this house. And I was thinking of that as I was reading Pearl, because I was so clear the farmhouse where Marianne and her dad and her brother and her mom all live is so clear in my head. And it's so much a part of this family. It's almost a member of the family.
Yeah, I do think of the house as having a character. And certainly when they have to move to a different house, that the character of the other house asserts itself as well. And they always call like the old house in the village she, and the new house is a he somehow. So I do think of that house as having a character. And I could draw you a map of everything inside that house and where you have to step up and step down and what it smells of and what things are made of and where the fireplace is and stuff. But I have actually never been inside that building. And when I went back to write this book again, when I moved back to the village, I went along that lane, go and find it. I thought it'd be inspiring. I'll go, and I'd never even been down the track, never even got down to the gate. So I thought I'll go and have a little sneak around, you know. And it'd gone, it'd been demolished.
Oh, wow.
It's not even there now. Yeah. And at first I didn't realize because a really smart new house had been built where it was. And I thought, oh, they've somebody's, you know, mended it, made it look all smart. And then somebody else said, no, it's not even in the same place. That one was pulled down. And this other new one was just built next to where it was. So yeah, now I'll never go inside it, except in my head.
Well, I was about to say, you've already been inside. But Pearl is kind of a unique coming of age story. I mean, Marianne doesn't know what's happened. It's part sort of literary mystery, right? Marianne doesn't know what's happened. She sees what happens to her family, but no one has an answer, so they're living with a feeling of uncertainty. And you do this in, what, 200-something pages? It's tiny.
Yeah, people do point this out to me when I say how many years it took me to write. They were going like, you know, your word count per year is very, very poor, Sian. All I can say is that I throw away at least 10 times more than gets into the book.
Okay. So. All right. Did you get a degree in creative writing?
I went back to my local university at Chester to do a PhD in creative writing and studied with a really wonderful prose poet called Ian Seed. And he was the person who helped me to finish this book, basically. Okay.
So between the moment you started with these characters and you're in high school, essentially.
Yeah.
How many years are we talking about that you worked on this book?
Well, I'm quite old. So, yeah, that's a long, long time. So I left high school in 1984.
Okay.
Yeah. But I didn't really have a plot for these characters. I had the setting of the house, and then and I had the characters, and they just sort of hung around, not doing anything. And I thought, oh, it'd be great if one day I could think of a plot for these people, and then I would have a book. So I was in my 20s, and a close friend of mine who was in a writing group that I was in at the time, he took his own life by drowning in a river. I was maybe 24 at the time. It was the first time that somebody close to me had done that. And I was so shocked because it just seemed the least likely person to ever feel that way. I couldn't understand how he, of all people, could feel that way. I was so angry about it that I got all these favorite characters that I'd been thinking about for about a decade at this point. And I wrote their names on a piece of paper, and I closed my eyes, and with my pen, I stuck on the page. And whoever's name it went on, I would make them do what he did. So the plot, as it appeared to me then, was sort of driven by sort of angry randomness. I had no idea why that character would do that. Why would she go into the river? It didn't make any sense to me. But because I was writing in response to something that didn't make any sense to me.
Right.
And I thought maybe I could write about something that feels random. And I wrote the book lots of times trying to find out for myself why this person might be feeling like that. And I think it took me a lifetime of experience to be able to be forgiving enough of that character, to be able to empathize with somebody whose mind is in a really fragile state and not to be judgmental about it. And I think that's why I'm glad that I wrote the book as a much older person, because I'm much, much kinder to all of the characters in it. And I feel great respect for them simply for having survived. And I feel empathy for those who didn't survive. And I don't feel any of that sort of angry, resentful, judgmental feeling that I had as a very young person when I first came across that experience.
What I didn't know until I started researching for the show was that your book is also in conversation in a way with a 14th century poem called Pearl.
Yeah, because it wasn't complicated enough, I just had to add that in.
Which I worked off of, I'm going to pull it up for the screen. I worked off of this copy, this Tolkien
the
translation.
Tolkien translation, yeah.
Yeah, it includes Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and also another poem, Sir Orfeo. And apparently the poet, who we don't know much about, was a contemporary of Chaucer's, though they probably never met. I had never read this poem until I was working on this episode of the show, and I've read it twice now. I think I understand most of it, but not all of it. I have never done, Old English, Middle English, none of it. But can you talk about how this poem came into your orbit? Because you've been sort of circling around, obviously not since the 14th century, but I think you have a really different experience of this poem than I do.
Yeah, this poem is probably my favorite piece of writing in English. I think that most writers who read it are sort of in awe of it. Mm-hmm. It's so incredibly complicated. It sets up so many impossible rules for itself. It's like a beautiful, beautifully made thing. But at the same time, it doesn't come across as a sort of formal game. It's actually a very, very moving, very, very personal piece of writing about the loss of a young child. And it was a few years after I'd studied it at university, I realized, probably I hadn't been a very good student, actually, not to have known this. I should probably have read the notes better. But anyway, I found out that it was written really near where I grew up, that the Chaucer contemporary thing, these poems are much harder to read than Chaucer in the original because they were written in Cheshire. And so the language that was spoken in Cheshire at the time didn't become modern English. The one in London became modern English. That was why Chaucer's quite easy to read now, really, comparatively. So these poems were written probably within a few miles of where I grew up. So when I realized this, the imagery in the poem of the walled gardens and the graveyard, obviously in my head, they all mixed up with the gardens and the graveyards that I know in my village and in the region where I belong. And the visit to the riverbank to talk to his child, who has now become a young woman. She died before she was 2. But she's on the other side of the river, and she gives him a sort of sermon. She lectures him on how he should accept death. But the characterization of the young girl is so good. It's not just like a flat sermon. She's like a sort of bossy 2-year-old saying, "Oh, Daddy, you're so silly. Don't you understand?"
Right.
And she's got all the sort of lack of tolerance in a way that she can't accept how despairing he is and how he can't bear to live without her. because she's just quoting the gospel back to him, telling him what he should think and what he should feel. But the whole sort of relationship between the two of them and his longing to join her is so beautifully done. It's so full of longing. And so obviously I felt that this poem sort of belonged to me because it belonged to my village and it belonged around here. And that then it sort of got mixed up in my story of the woman who goes to the river. And so I always wanted to write something that was a response to Pearl. It's not an attempt to translate it or to tell its story again, because I'm actually telling a different story. But it is a response to that poem, though sometimes it's a response to what I think was the poem, because I'm not very accurate. Because when you remember something you really love reading, you remember one little bit, and that little bit is like super important to you. So there's a bit in the poem where he goes to the grave and he lies on the grave and he says he hears in the silence the most beautiful songs he's ever heard in his life. And these songs sort of take him into a dream. The songs are sort of the transport that get him from where he is in his dream to a place where he can talk to his dead daughter. And I thought songs were so important. I thought they were like really, really important in this poem. So I based lots of things in my book on songs, and I've got little children's rhymes. And I was thinking the songs that he's listing, he must be like the singing that his little girl did. And I was thinking of children chanting and playing rhymes. And so I've got lots of children's songs all the way through the book. And then I went back to the poem to check my references, check where it came from. And I found a little bit about songs, and it's a line and a half out of a book-length poem. And somehow in my mind, this line and a half had become so important. But it's obviously not a very accurate reading because it's barely a mention. But to me, it felt really important.
Yeah, but I love hearing you tell that story because for me, like you find these weird details whenever you're reading, right? And you're a bookseller, you know this as well as I do. But when you're just reading and you find this weird detail that just sticks. And, and I can't ever really predict what it's going to be. Sometimes it's landscape, sometimes it's... But I love those moments where you're like, oh, yeah, I've never heard it stated that way before, but absolutely, this is the thing.
Mm.
And I felt like I was in a world that I didn't necessarily understand, but I absolutely recognized. And I mean, you're also writing about class and you're writing about shame and trauma and separation and all of these things that, translate across communities and place and all of this kind of thing. But I really also felt like I was someplace I had never been before, which it's hard to do both, right?
I guess, you can only write from your own heart, can't you? So you can only write from where you are. I'm just always really humbled and just delighted when I talk to someone who's read it. I just think, gosh, you've read all of it. Thank you. Thank you for giving all that time to it. And the book has come out in India and various other places. When it came out in India, I was talking to an Indian reviewer.
Mm-hmm.
And I was saying, I was just so pleased that people somewhere else could imagine themselves in that world or could be in it. And I was just really moved by that idea. And he said, oh, we totally get it here. The idea you have a home village, that's where your ancestors are buried, that's your home territory. It doesn't matter which city you're working in or living in, you know where you belong, where you come from. I thought, oh yeah, well, maybe this thing isn't so strange. Maybe people in lots of different places can relate to that. But it always moves me when they do. I always just think it's really, really lovely that somebody picked it up and read it.
It also has a really great jacket. I love the painting. That jacket is so great. I mean, yeah, I really love the jacket. Hey, you and I share some favorite writers. Elizabeth Strout. You loved Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver the way I did.
Oh, I absolutely loved it. Yeah.
Shuggie Bain, the Douglas Stewart, which won the National Book Award here. I also love Young Mungo.
Yeah,
he's so good.
I don't like it as much, but I did absolutely eat Shuggie Bain alive. I went right to the end and then had to go back to the beginning. I was just hooked by that voice right from the start. Totally invested in that small person. And I suppose same with Demon Copperhead. But for someone who loves David Copperfield, Demon Copperhead has got all this added layer of delight, hasn't it? Because you're waiting for your favourite characters to come in and you're thinking, how's she going to do this one? What are they going to be like? And they don't disappoint. They absolutely do not. So that was another one that I just swallowed whole, I think.
I'm going to be the flip side, too, because I'm not a David Copperfield person at all.
Have you not read it?
Oh, I have. I just don't have the warm fuzzies about it the way other readers do. So I will say, though, if you pick up Demon Copperhead, you can read it without needing to have... I mean, it's a delight. Everyone I know who is a fan of Dickens and a fan of David Copperfield, they speak about it the way you do, too. But I just want to put up a hand for those of us who are not.
It's okay. But I think that... more important than whether or not you know the story or like, you know, what Dickens did with his life story, because it is his autobiographical novel. I just couldn't help feeling that Dickens was somewhere on the other side of the river of death cheering like crazy for this book, because he wrote about really important contemporary issues, and he gave voices to people who were totally voiceless in his society. And he sought them out, and people would actually seek out injustices and bring them to him and say, can you please do a book about this? Nobody knows about this. And when he wrote about them, he really wanted them to change. He didn't write about the status quo as status quo. He wrote like a rallying cry. I just couldn't help feeling that there were so many important contemporary things in Demon Copperhead that were brought to life, and you were made to feel for the people trapped in those situations so strongly that I thought Charles Dickens would be so proud of this. If he were alive today, this would be what he wanted to write about. He would be up there shouting about this and saying, will somebody please wake up and help these people?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think at least fiction that I love, I do want it to be grounded in the world. Whatever that means, right? Like, I don't always need narrative nonfiction, though sometimes it can be really fun to read. But I do think that for me, like, if I look at something like Michael Cunningham's The Hours, or if I look at any of Elizabeth Strout's novels, there is real life sort of pulsing in the background, right? Yeah. And it gives you a moment to sort of look around you. And even if it's not the exact, I mean, I use The Hours all the time, and, you know, it opens in Pasadena, California in the 1950s. And, you know, that was more than a minute ago. But I do, there's something about it where I'm just like, this is what I want. I want these people. I want to know what they're thinking. I want to understand where they're coming from, what their point of view is. You also love Ayobami Adebayo's Spell of Good Things, too, which is a novel I love. And I know nothing about Nigeria.
No, I don't either. Though my daughter just got married in Ghana, which is not so far from Nigeria. My daughter got married in Ghana last week.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It was my very first trip to West Africa. And really my only point of reference in West Africa was reading novels set in Nigeria. So it was all a fantastic revelation to me. But I think that I've described Adebayo as the Dickens of Lagos. And I think The Spell of Good Things is like a Dickensian tour through Lagos, that you've got every layer of society and how they're all interconnected, even if they don't acknowledge their interconnection, and how the corruption like seeps into every single life and affects everything from, you know, what you can eat and drink and what the ground feels like under your feet, even, that everything is affected by that political world. I did love her first book, but I think this second one is so mature and broad reaching, and it did have that thing. I was thinking, yes, you are Charles Dickens today, alive in Lagos, and you are showing the world the way that this society it is put together and how it impacts people in so many different ways. And I just love the characters in it as well. She completely hooks you in. I think she's a complete genius. I was just really, really surprised she didn't win the Booker Prize with it. I read it and I was like, well, everyone else can just go home, you know. I know there were some great books on there, but like I read that and I was like, people are going to be reading this in 100 years. You know, this book is here to stay.
Yeah, I had a similar feeling, honestly. But Richard Russo, also on your list of authors you love, Marilyn Robinson, Elizabeth Strout, who I mentioned, and Anne Tyler. So
Anne Tyler's probably my favorite. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think of those four, though, as sort of quintessentially American novelists.
Oh, really? All right, because I think I really love their creation of like they have a whole world that they can dip in and out of. So they've got their world there, and new characters can walk in and out of it, But their fictional world is sort of there, and I really like that, the way that they can talk about things that are massive and universal inside this sort of little created world. It sort of reminds me of when we were children, and like all of your toys have names and relations, and like you take them out in the garden and have like wars and battlefields and things, and you make this whole enclosed world that you, as a child, you're testing out your knowledge of the world in the way that these different invented creatures are relating to each other. And so I quite like that sort of playfulness that they all have. Let's pretend there's this town that is like this, and then let's put these people in and let's see what happens. So I like that.
Well, I'm just laughing too, because I'm thinking about a couple of things Russo has done in recent novels where I'm just like, sorry, they're very funny moments. And if you've read any of the straight man novels, you know.
Yeah, I do. And you do get the giggles in those books. And sometimes as a writer, you have one of those giggly moments. So you've got your characters, and sometimes like the most fun is when you don't know what's going to happen to them. So you just open up your laptop and you're like, what are you going to say to me today? What are you going to do? Where are you going to go? And sometimes they just do the most ridiculous, outrageous things. And you go, oh, honestly, I can't put that in, But it's just like sort of tuning in to a radio station that's in your head, or I'm tuning into the radio station where these people are talking. It's like, okay, I'm ready. Tell me what you're up to, Sometimes I'm totally surprised by what they're going to do.
I love that sense of play, because even when we're talking about somber things in Pearl, I do feel like there's a sense of play. I do feel like you're looking for new ways to tell what could be interpreted as a very classic story. I'm not riffing off of the 14th century poem there. I'm talking about stories about parents and children in tiny communities and, coming of age and all of this stuff. And there's some secondary characters in this novel. It is a very tight cast, but there's some secondary characters, one of whom you and I discussed before we started taping. I was like, yeah, I don't like that kid.
I don't like her.
Straight up, I don't like that kid, and I don't like her mother.
No, but it won't be a spoiler because nobody ever spots this at all. But there are quite a lot of fairy stories or traditional tales like sort of woven through the book, and those particular characters are supposed to be, though nobody's ever spotted it, a sort of Cinderella's step sisters and stepmother character. That there is like, that's the role that they're taking. Because obviously in the traditional Cinderella stories, the mother takes the form of like a tree or a cow or something and feeds the child. And there are these other people who are trying to starve her. And that's the new mother and her children. They're trying to take all the food for their children and not feed this other child. The connections in that little bit to like eating or not eating, or thriving or not thriving, or cutting your hair off, or putting yourself in danger. Like they're supposed to have a sort of malicious fairy tale type creepiness to them.
Which I think is perfect, because we do meet Marianne the first time when she's 8, and that is how kids see the world, right? And we've all, I think, as adults come to realize that fairy tales were not quite what we were told when we were kids. And if you go back to the original Grimm's, I'm just going to use that as an example, it's pretty gruesome stuff. It is pretty gruesome, straight up. We're going to try and make sure that you understand that behavior outside of the accepted norm is unacceptable, and it will get you in very, very bad places. And I remember reading Grimm sort of as a younger adult and thinking, yeah, it's really good that no one handed me these as a tiny person.
Yeah, they're pretty scary. And the transmigration of the soul thing, that the soul of the dead person will go into any natural object.
Right.
I did sort of borrow that little bit from fairy stories, where instead of having like a ghost there's just like a presence which can be felt through particular plants or smells of plants or in the natural world. The idea that the soul just passes into whatever whatever is naturally growing around there, and will sort of enact their revenge or take action, have like a real presence in the world through whatever thing the soul's decided to go into. I thought that was a really powerful idea. If somebody is missing, the idea that their spirit could just travel through nature and appear wherever they wanted to.
It also feels like something that works much better outside of a city. It's just an idea, I mean, it's, and I say this as a person who's, only about a mile from Central Park as we tape, but I do think there's something to be said for sort of the wildness of a rural landscape, whether it's in Cheshire or somewhere in the US. The rural, nature can be intense.
Yeah. And it can creep up on you. I suppose if, like the way that I describe the mint roots in the book is supposed to be, like the way that memory or the memory of a person can sort of go underground, and that the roots of it is like a system that's going everywhere around. You never know where it's going to pop up, or you never know when you're going to put your foot on it. Because when you put your foot on the mint, then like it releases the scent, but you never know where it's going to come up because its root system is just underneath. And so I was thinking of, human feelings almost in terms of like fungus growth, like the networks of invisibility joining every living thing up, so that a particular feeling, hasn't gone anywhere. It's just gone underground, and it's that feeling has sent out its own root system, and then decades later you'll be somewhere else and you're just going to press on another shoot of it, but it's still there.
So we are bumping up against time a little bit, but can I ask you how you ended up being a bookseller?
On a whim, really. Yeah, was probably not the most, financially sound thing I've ever done in my life. So I would be going past this building. It's been empty for a very long time. But and partly because a lot of people think it's haunted. It's a very, very old building. Yeah, it's a very, very old building. It's really beautiful, listed building. The cellar, nobody knows how old it is. The most of the building is probably built 1600 and something. Lots of it's falling down. So that's like one bad thing about buying a building, it's falling down. But I'd seen this building empty for ages and ages, and I'd heard all these stories that, nobody wanted it because it was really creepy. And I just kept thinking it'd be a really nice bookshop. I kept going past it and thinking, I wish that was a bookshop. If there was a bookshop on that corner, I just so want to pop in. Wouldn't that be nice? And so in the end, I thought, well, maybe I'll open a bookshop in it. And I tried to buy it and I failed. Somebody else bought it for cash. Then how when you didn't know you want something and then someone takes it away and then you think, oh, I really did want it. So then I suddenly thought, oh no, I did really want to do that. And then being a village where everybody knows, if not everyone else, someone who knows somebody else. Right. I was just getting my son ready to go to swimming lessons one night, and there was a knock at the door, and there was a man at the door, and he said that he knew a friend of mine in the village, and he'd been talking to this friend, and he'd been the one who'd bought the building when I tried to, and had failed. And he said, I'm the person who bought that building that you wanted down the road. And Lindsay says you still want it, and I've changed my mind. So do you want to swap your house for it? And I went, yeah, okay. And then he looked around my house in about 5 minutes, basically counted the rooms, looked how old the kitchen and bathroom were, went, yeah, okay, you can have it. So we shook hands on the doorstep and swapped.
That's such a great story.
So it was totally on a whim. And next day I said to my sister, oh, you never guess what happened to me last night? I bought a bookshop.
What year was that?
That was 2 years ago we opened. So that would be like 2.5 years ago.
And I hear you're working on a new novel that features Marianne. Is this still the case?
Yeah. Well, I'm writing, you probably noticed from your Tolkien thing that there are 2 other poems, as well as Gawain the Green Knight, which has been translated to bits in all kinds of formats. And there's Pearl, and there's 2 others called Patience and Purity. Yep. From the same manuscript. And Patience is the story of Jonah and the whale. It's really funny the way it's done. It's just, I don't know, it's like a cartoon version of Jonah and the Whale. It's hysterical. Anyway, and then Purity is all about cleanness of the soul, how you prepare your soul for heaven. But even though it's based on lots of texts where there's things in the Bible where people are told off for like having dirty clothes and stuff, like being invited to the wedding feast and not being dressed appropriately. Really, it's a very long poem all about laundry, as far as I can see. Loads and loads of words for dirty clothes in it and how you get them clean. I mean, whoever wrote it knew a lot about laundry. That's all I can say. So I am writing a sequel where Marianne is 10 years older. That's the one that's based on Patience. So she is living on a canal boat and has a cat called Jonah.
Okay. I was feeling a little Sigrid Nunez, the friend, when I first heard about the book, and now I'm thinking, wait a minute, those poems are funny. And I really want to see this book. I really want to read this book. I wanted to read it to begin with, but I've never heard 14th century poetry described as hysterically funny. And now I'm kind of like,
Yeah, but when I was a teacher, I remember I was teaching Chaucer one time, and they were having to, annotate a particular bit.
Right.
And they had to mention, to get the pass mark, they had to mention that it was funny. They had to specifically say, this is called humor. And I couldn't get this class to identify that it was funny at all. They identified all these different things. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to just tell you this because you're not going to get the marks unless you say that this is funny. And there's just this dead silence in the class. And one of them said, Sean, that's just what old people think is funny.
Ow.
So, yeah, I'm aware that when I think that something written in the 14th century is funny, that's probably just me.
I'm going to take you at it's funny. I'm going to look for the funny. I really am going to look for the funny. But also, I like Marianne, and I'm glad to know that she's getting more story. I was wondering if that was going to happen.
Yeah, I didn't think of that at all when I was writing it. I didn't ever consider that there would be a sequel. I think I was just so wrapped up in the story of Pearl that it was a few years after finishing writing it that I began to think, do you know what? I would really like to know what happens to her next. I wonder what she does next. Yeah.
That seems like a really good place to end this conversation. So I'm going to say thank you, Siân Hughes. Pearl is out now. And we'll just, hang out until we get the second volume of Marianne's adventures. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Topoff. We're going to recommend a couple of fantastic books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Pearl. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm going to have my book buddy Donald in Detroit kick things off for us. Donald, hello. What have you got for us?
Hey, Mark. Hey, everybody. So this was an interesting one. Pearl, it's another one of those short novels. Those are coming out fast and furious lately, and I'm so glad because I think in our world and everything that we're going through, short novels just are so important and valuable, and it helps us, explore different things. Pearl was an excellent book, and the one that I picked this week is called Old God's Time by Sebastian Barry for a couple reasons. One, it's also short. Both of these books were Booker Prize nominees, which I think is awesome. She was longlisted for the Booker Prize for Pearl, so that's awesome. Old got 300 pages, so super short, but it's also surreal, strange, atmospheric. It is set, in international waters, just like Pearl is, but even more so than that, I think what really stuck out to me with Pearl and why Old God's Time stuck out and really connected with me was that sense of love, grief, secrets, memory, a mystery set in this small, compact little story. Like, it's really simple, really quick to read, and you're just given such a wide understanding of where these characters come from. Old God's Time is also very strange and whimsical and outlandish at times and bizarre. And I felt that way with Pearl in many occasions too. So that's why that was the one that jumped out to me the most. Sebastian Barry also just does a really good job at creating characters who we feel we can connect with on a really, really personal level, and yet don't really exist in many other fictional worlds that you come across. Like, he's just very, very unique in his writing, and it's very short, very snappy, almost poetic. Pearl is very poetic too. It's kind of also based on a poem. So again, those are the threads that came together for me. So my pick was Old God's Time by Sebastian Barry. And Mark, what do you have for us?
I love that pick, and you're right, the short novels are making me very, very happy. I like something that's just tight and does everything that it needs to do in a one-sitting read. So, nice pick. I went with something a little bit more twee, but has a similar kind of feeling, and that is a classic, The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is one that everybody knows this book. They know the name of it. It's been around for kind of a long time. I think 1911 was when it first came out. But I realized that when I was reading Pearl, that it feels like Pearl is sort of a dark, kind of more trauma-filled, atmospheric cousin to The Secret Garden, in that it is about a young girl who is dealing with loss and comes across something a little bit otherworldly, not quite, but charming, mystical, magical, that helps her cope. When The Secret Garden kind of came to my mind, I thought, I haven't thought about this book in a long time. I've shelved it many times in our sections. I've recommended it to younger audiences and adult audiences as well throughout the years, but I really haven't sat down to really think about what this book has done over the years. So just a quick elevator pitch as far as the plot. If you don't know already, I hope you do. It follows a young orphan named Mary who is basically shipped off to the English countryside to live with her uncle. While she's there, she discovers some delightful mysteries and lasting friendships, and really a renewed sense of joy in what that means, that she infuses not only in herself, but in the people around who really needed it more than they realized. And so, because Pearl has a similar trajectory of somebody coping with something difficult and using something as a vehicle to come to terms with their lot and tries to make sense of a world that can be sometimes pretty terrible, I think The Secret Garden has some nice little through lines and sort of companion themes going on. And I just feel like it's a good opportunity to revisit something that you can read in one sitting that just can bring you a little bit of joy and charm. It's one that stands the test of time for a reason. It's one that a young audience can come to terms with a lot of grown-up themes. And it's one that adults can relive some of those feelings of what it's like to be a child dealing with something tough. So check out The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. But guess what? That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. And you can follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow me at BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.